My name is Jessica Morgan, and at 14 years old, I learned that cruelty often wears the mask of family tradition. What started as the promise of my first real birthday celebration ended with me standing alone in a field outside Bakersfield, California, watching my father's pickup truck disappear in a cloud of dust and mockery. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. But this isn't just a story about abandonment. This is about how that single moment of betrayal became the foundation for everything that followed, including the day, 25 years later, when I held his life in my hands and he finally understood what he had planted in that empty field. We lived in a cramped duplex on Oleander Street, where the walls were thin and privacy was a luxury we couldn't afford. My father, Robert Morgan, had spent 15 years as a corrections officer at Kern Valley State Prison before an injury forced his early retirement. He was a man who measured worth through dominance, who found his identity in the fear he could inspire in others. My mother, Linda, moved through our home like a shadow, speaking only when spoken to, defending only his actions, never mine. Then there was my younger brother, Tyler, 11 years old and blessed with the kind of easy charm that made adults smile. He was my father's pride, the son who could do no wrong, whose every achievement was celebrated while mine were dismissed as mere expectation. The weeks leading up to my 14th birthday had felt different. For the first time in years, there were whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. My mother had taken me to the Walmart on Ming Avenue and bought me a sundress, yellow with tiny daisies, telling me to save it for something special. Even Tyler, who usually delighted in my misfortune, seemed to be holding back some secret that made him smirk whenever he looked at me. My father, who typically forgot my birthday entirely or marked it with criticism disguised as life lessons, had actually acknowledged the approaching date. He told me to be ready by 2 o'clock on Saturday for a special outing, just the family. The words special coming from his mouth felt foreign, almost dangerous. But I was 14 and desperate to believe that this year might be different. I spent the morning of my birthday in careful preparation. I showered twice, attempting to tame my unruly brown hair with a borrowed curling iron that belonged to our upstairs neighbor. I put on the yellow dress and even attempted makeup with a tube of lip gloss I'd bought with my allowance money. Looking in the cracked mirror of our shared bathroom, I allowed myself to imagine possibilities. Maybe a restaurant dinner, maybe a movie, maybe just the simple acknowledgement that I mattered enough to celebrate. When 2 o'clock arrived, I was waiting by the front door, clutching a small purse that contained my birthday money from my grandmother, $37 that represented the only gift I'd received. My father emerged from the bedroom, wearing his weekend uniform of jeans and a flannel shirt, keys jingling in his hand. Tyler was already in the truck, bouncing with barely contained excitement in the passenger seat. My mother appeared with a red bandana in her hands, her expression unreadable. "It's a surprise," she said, approaching me with what I mistook for maternal tenderness. "We want you to be surprised." The way she said it should have been my first warning. The bandana was rough against my face as she tied it around my eyes, her fingers lingering for just a moment before she guided me toward the truck. I climbed into the back seat, the vinyl hot against my legs despite the October chill. The engine started, and I felt the familiar vibration of the old Ford as it pulled away from our street. My father's voice filled the cab, unusually animated as he spoke to Tyler about school, about football, about everything except the birthday girl sitting blindfolded behind them. "You're gonna remember this day for the rest of your life," my father said, and Tyler giggled in response. There was something in that laugh that made my stomach tighten, but I pushed the feeling away. I was determined to trust, to believe that, for once, I was worth celebrating. The drive felt longer than usual. We left the familiar streets of our neighborhood, the smooth asphalt giving way to rougher roads. I could hear gravel crunching under the tires, then the unmistakable sound of dirt roads. The truck bounced and lurched, my father cursing at potholes while Tyler's excitement seemed to build with every mile. When we finally stopped, the silence was immediate and complete. No traffic, no voices, no signs of civilization. Just the ticking of the cooling engine and the sound of 3 car doors opening. I remained seated, waiting for someone to help me out, to guide me to whatever surprise awaited. "Get out," my father's voice was flat, devoid of the warmth I'd hoped to hear. I fumbled with the door handle, stepping onto uneven ground that felt soft and unstable beneath my dress shoes. The air smelled of dust and decay, nothing like the restaurant or movie theater I'd imagined. I stood there, still blindfolded, still believing, still hoping that the punchline would be worth the setup. Then I heard it, the sound of doors slamming, one after another. The engine roared to life. I tore the bandana from my eyes. Before me stood a structure that seemed to lean against the sky for support, a barn so weathered and neglected that entire sections of its walls had collapsed inward. Rusted farming equipment lay scattered around the property like the bones of dead animals. Weeds grew waist-high, creating a maze of abandonment that stretched to the horizon. I turned just in time to see our truck executing a careful three-point turn, my father's face visible through the driver's side window. He was smiling, not with warmth or love, but with the satisfaction of a man who had successfully delivered a punchline. Tyler hung out the passenger window, his phone in his hand, clearly recording my reaction. "Happy barn day, Jessica," he shouted, his voice carrying across the empty field. My mother's face appeared briefly in the back window, but she looked away quickly, unable or unwilling to meet my eyes. The truck accelerated, leaving behind a cloud of dust that hung in the air long after the sound of the engine had faded. And then there was silence, the kind of profound quiet that exists only in forgotten places, broken only by the distant sound of something metal creaking in the wind. I stood there in my yellow dress, $37 in my purse, surrounded by nothing but abandoned dreams, and the growing realization that I had been the joke all along. This wasn't a birthday surprise. It was a message. It was my father's way of telling me exactly how much I was worth to him, how little my existence mattered in the grand scheme of his world. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills, and I understood with crystal clarity that no one was coming back for me. This wasn't a prank with a punchline and a rescue. This was abandonment, pure and simple, delivered with the efficiency of a man who had spent years learning how to break people down. I kicked off my dress shoes, feeling the packed earth of the barnyard beneath my feet. I looked back once at the structure that had become the setting for my humiliation, then turned my back on it and began walking down the dirt road that had brought us here. Each step was a declaration, not of defeat, but of defiance. If they thought leaving me here would break me, they were about to learn how wrong they could be. The road stretched ahead of me, empty and uncertain, but it was leading away from that barn, away from their laughter, away from the life where I had been nothing more than the punchline to someone else's cruel joke. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew with absolute certainty that I would never let anyone make me feel this small again. Behind me, the barn stood silent, already becoming part of a past I was determined to leave behind. Ahead of me lay everything else, the unknown, the uncertain, the possibility that somewhere beyond this dirt road was a version of myself that my father had never imagined possible. I started walking, and I didn't look back. The dirt road seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, disappearing into heat mirages that danced on the horizon. I had been walking for what felt like hours, my feet already blistered and bleeding from the rough gravel that cut through my thin socks. The yellow dress that had seemed so perfect that morning now clung to my back with sweat, the daisy pattern mocking me with its cheerfulness. Every few minutes, I would turn around, some desperate part of me still believing they might come back. That this was all an elaborate test, a harsh lesson that would end with my father's truck appearing over the hill, my family laughing about how they'd really gotten me this time. But the road behind me remained as empty as the one ahead, and with each passing hour, the reality of my situation settled deeper into my bones. The sun was merciless, beating down on the back of my neck until I could feel the skin beginning to burn. I had finished the small bottle of water from my purse within the first hour, and now my mouth felt like it was filled with cotton. The $37 seemed worthless out here. You can't buy rescue from an empty sky. I tried to remember the route we'd taken from our house, but the blindfold had stolen that knowledge from me. All I knew was that we'd driven for at least 40 minutes, maybe more, and that we'd left the paved roads far behind. I could be anywhere in Kern County. miles from the nearest phone or person who might help. The landscape around me was unforgiving, acres of dry grass punctuated by the occasional oil derrick, their mechanical heads bobbing like giant metal birds. In the distance, the Tehachapi Mountains rose like a wall, beautiful and impossibly far away. This was the kind of country where people disappeared, where a 14-year-old girl in a yellow dress might walk until she simply couldn't anymore. But I kept walking because the alternative was unthinkable. Sitting down meant giving up, and giving up meant letting them win. Every step was a small victory against the voice in my head that whispered, I should have seen this coming, should have known better than to trust them, should have understood that in the Morgan family hierarchy, I would always be expendable. My feet were on fire by the time I saw the first sign of civilization, a mailbox leaning at a drunken angle beside a gravel driveway that disappeared around a bend lined with pepper trees. The faded numbers read 3,847, but they might as well have been coordinates to paradise. I stumbled up the driveway, each step sending shards of pain through my ruined feet. The house that came into view was modest but well-maintained, a single-story ranch with a wraparound porch and flower boxes that someone actually cared for. A blue Chevy pickup sat in the driveway, and I could see the glow of a television through the front window. Normal life, continuing as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis for me. I hesitated at the bottom of the porch steps, suddenly aware of how I must look: dirty, bleeding, desperate. What would I say? How do you explain that your own family has abandoned you without sounding crazy? But the pain in my feet made the decision for me. I climbed the steps and knocked on the door. The woman who answered was probably in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. She took in my appearance in a single glance: the torn dress, the bloody feet, the tear tracks through the dust on my face, and stepped aside without a word. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Come in, honey, she said, her voice carrying the particular gentleness that some people reserve for wounded animals. Let's get you cleaned up. Her name was Margaret Chen, and she had been a nurse at Bakersfield Memorial for 37 years before retiring. She didn't ask questions at first, just guided me to her kitchen and began treating my feet with the efficient kindness of someone who had seen every kind of human damage. The antiseptic stung, but I bit my lip and didn't make a sound. You want to tell me how you ended up walking barefoot down Buena Vista Road? She asked as she wrapped gauze around my feet. Her tone was casual, but I could see the concern in her eyes. The whole story poured out of me then. The birthday promise, the blindfold, the barn, the abandonment. Margaret listened without interruption, her hands gentle but sure as she continued her ministrations. When I finished, she sat back and studied my face. And you're how old? She asked. 14. Today, it's my birthday. Something shifted in her expression, a hardness that hadn't been there before. Well, happy birthday, Jessica, though I suspect this isn't how you planned to spend it. She made me a sandwich, peanut butter and jelly on white bread that tasted like the finest meal I'd ever eaten, and let me use her phone to call home. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice artificially bright. Oh, Jessica, you found your way. That's good, honey. We were wondering when you'd call. Come get me, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Well, we're kind of in the middle of something right now. Tyler has a game tonight, and your father. Come get me now. There was a pause, and I could hear my father's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. When my mother came back online, her tone had changed. Jessica, you're being dramatic. It was just a little joke. You found help, didn't you? You're fine. We'll pick you up tomorrow after Tyler's tournament. The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, the dial tone buzzing like an angry insect. Margaret was watching me from across the kitchen, and I saw my own shock reflected in her eyes. They're not coming, I said, though saying it out loud made it somehow more real, more terrible. Margaret stood up, moved to her kitchen window, and looked out at the darkening sky. When she turned back to me, her expression had transformed into something I would later recognize as protective fury. Well then, she said, I guess you're staying for dinner. And probably breakfast, too. That night, I slept in Margaret's guest room on sheets that smelled like lavender and safety. She had given me one of her old nightgowns, soft from years of washing, and for the first time in hours I felt human again. Through the thin walls, I could hear her on the phone, her voice low and intense as she spoke to someone about child abandonment and what kind of people. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. This morning I had been Jessica Morgan, the forgotten daughter who still believed she might matter to her family. Tonight I was something else. A girl who had been thrown away like garbage and had somehow survived the disposal. But there was something else growing alongside the hurt and confusion. It felt like a small, hard seed planted deep in my chest, and I recognized it as anger. Not the hot, explosive kind that burns out quickly, but the cold, patient variety that could sustain me through whatever came next. Margaret knocked on the door around 10 o'clock, carrying a cup of chamomile tea and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. "I called Child Protective Services," she said without preamble. "They'll want to talk to you tomorrow." I sat up in bed, suddenly alert. What will happen? "I don't know, honey, but what happened to you today isn't okay. It's not normal, and it's not something you should have to just accept." She sat on the edge of the bed, her weight causing the mattress to dip slightly. "Jessica, I want you to understand something. What your family did to you today, that's not your fault. You didn't deserve it, and you don't have to pretend it was okay just because they're your family." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed her yet. The idea that I deserved better seemed foreign, dangerous even. What if I started believing it and then discovered I was wrong? "Get some sleep," Margaret said, standing up. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." But as I lay there in the darkness, I realized that part of me already knew what came next. Jessica, who had put on a yellow dress that morning, who had believed in birthday surprises and family love, was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who would never again trust a blindfold or believe in promises from people who were supposed to protect her. The anger in my chest grew a little stronger, and I welcomed it. It felt like the first honest thing I'd experienced all day. The Child Protective Services office on Truxtun Avenue smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken promises. I sat in a plastic chair that had probably witnessed 1,000 other stories of family failure, my bandaged feet barely touching the linoleum floor. Margaret sat beside me, her purse clutched in her lap like armor, ready to do battle with a system she clearly didn't trust. The social worker assigned to my case was a tired-looking woman named Diana Reeves, probably in her 40s, with the kind of perpetual exhaustion that comes from seeing too much human cruelty and having too few resources to fix it. She had reviewed the police report that Margaret had insisted on filing and the photos of my injuries, but her expression suggested this was just another Tuesday in her world. "So, Jessica," she said, settling behind her metal desk with a manila folder that contained my entire life reduced to a few typed pages, "tell me about your relationship with your parents." I had rehearsed this moment during the sleepless hours at Margaret's house, but now that it was here, the words felt inadequate. "How do you explain a lifetime of being invisible, of watching your brother receive love, while you received criticism disguised as character building?" "They don't like me very much," I said finally, which felt like the most honest summary I could offer. Diana's pen moved across her notepad. "Can you be more specific? Has there been physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect?" "They fed me," I said, understanding that this was what she needed to hear. "They gave me clothes and a place to sleep. They don't want me around." This was the problem, I realized. What my family had done to me lived in the spaces between the legal definitions of abuse. Emotional cruelty doesn't leave bruises that photograph well. Systematic humiliation doesn't fit neatly into checkbox categories. The kind of damage they had inflicted was invisible, which made it easy to dismiss. Diana asked about the barn incident, taking notes as I recounted the details. But I could see in her eyes that she was already calculating resources, already measuring my story against more urgent cases. A teenager who had been abandoned for a few hours and then rescued didn't rank high on the triage list of human misery. "I'm going to arrange for a home visit," she said, closing the folder. "We'll interview your parents and assess the home environment. In the meantime, Mrs. Chen has agreed to provide temporary care, which is fortunate because our emergency placement options are limited. Margaret's hand found mine, a small gesture that meant everything. But I could read between the lines of Diana's bureaucratic language. They would visit my parents, who would perform normalcy with Academy Award-winning skill. My father would be charming and concerned. My mother would play the worried parent. And Tyler would be the perfect son who couldn't imagine why his sister was causing such drama. The home visit happened 3 days later. Diana called Margaret's house afterwards to report that the Morgan family seemed functional and that my parents were, quote, concerned about my well-being and eager for my return. They had expressed confusion about why I had overreacted to what they described as a harmless prank that went too far. They've agreed to family counseling, Diana informed me, as if this solved everything. And they understand that abandoning a minor, even temporarily, is unacceptable behavior. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Family counseling with people who saw me as a burden to be managed, rather than a daughter to be loved. But I was learning that the system operated on the assumption that families wanted to be fixed, that parents naturally loved their children, that home was always the safest place for a kid to be. The return happened on a Thursday afternoon. Margaret drove me to Oleander Street, her knuckles white on the steering wheel as she pulled into our driveway. She had packed a bag for me with new clothes she'd bought, along with a small flip phone for emergencies, and her business card tucked into the front pocket. "You call me if you need anything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Anything at all, Jessica. Promise me." I promised, though we both knew that once I walked through that front door, I would be back in their world, subject to their rules, cut off from the outside validation that had kept me sane for the past week. My family was waiting in the living room when I entered, arranged like actors before a performance. My father sat in his recliner, remote control in hand, projecting the image of a man interrupted from his leisure time. My mother hovered near the kitchen, wearing the floral apron that she only used when company was coming. Tyler lounged on the couch, his phone in his hands, looking bored by the entire production. "Well," my father said without looking up from the television, "I hope you learned something from your little adventure." That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement of what they had done, no recognition that abandoning your child in the middle of nowhere might have been traumatic. Just a casual comment that somehow made their cruelty my fault. My mother approached me with a tight smile. "We missed you, honey. Why don't you put your things away and then come help me with dinner?" I looked around the room, at the family photos that featured Tyler prominently while I appeared as an afterthought, at the trophy shelf that displayed his achievements while mine had been relegated to a cardboard box in the garage, at the whole carefully constructed mythology of our happy family life. "Okay," I said, because fighting would only give them more ammunition to use against me. But that night, lying in my narrow bed in the room I shared with Tyler, I began to plan. Not a dramatic escape that would fail within hours, but something longer term, something that would take me so far from their reach that I could never be dragged back. I had turned 14 3 days ago in the most brutal way possible, but I felt decades older. Jessica, who had believed in birthday surprises, was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival required strategy, patience, and the willingness to become someone my family would never recognize. I started small. At school, I researched emancipation laws, discovering that California allowed minors to petition for legal independence under specific circumstances. I learned about military recruitment policies, about scholarships and work-study programs, about all the ways a person could build a life without family support. In the public library after school, I read everything I could find about people who had escaped difficult childhoods. I studied their methods, their timing, their mistakes. I learned that successful escape required not just the courage to leave, but the skills to survive once you were gone. At home, I became invisible in a different way. Instead of shrinking from their cruelty, I simply disappeared. I spoke only when directly addressed, moved through our shared spaces like a ghost, gave them nothing to criticize or mock. My silence became my shield, my absence became my weapon. Tyler noticed first. "What's wrong with Jessica?" I heard him ask my mother one evening. "She's being weird." "She's probably still sulking about her birthday," my mother replied dismissively. "She'll get over it." But I wasn't sulking. I was studying them, learning their patterns, understanding their weaknesses. My father's need for control, my mother's desperate desire to avoid conflict, Tyler's dependence on their approval. These weren't just personality traits, they were vulnerabilities I might someday exploit. I began keeping a journal, hidden beneath my mattress, where I documented every slight, every cruel comment, every moment when they revealed their true feelings about me. Not for revenge, but for clarity. I needed to remember exactly why I was planning to leave, especially during the moments when loneliness might tempt me to forgive them. The most important thing I learned during those weeks was that I was completely alone in this house. There would be no moment of realization where they suddenly understood what they had done to me. There would be no tearful apology or family reconciliation. They had shown me exactly who they were at that barn, and everything since had only confirmed it. But being alone, I discovered, could also mean being free. Free from the exhausting work of trying to earn love that would never come. Free from the hope that made every disappointment feel like a fresh wound. Free to focus all my energy on the only person who had ever truly mattered in my life, myself. 4 months after my 14th birthday, I made 2 decisions that would change everything. First, I would leave home the day I turned 18, not a moment sooner or later. Second, I would spend every day between now and then preparing for a life they couldn't touch, couldn't ruin, couldn't reach. I had learned the most important lesson of my young life. Sometimes the only way to survive your family is to outlive your need for them. And I intended to do exactly that. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took 2 years of methodical preparation before I began to recognize the person I was becoming. By my junior year at East Bakersfield High School, I had evolved into someone my family barely acknowledged, which was exactly what I wanted. I had learned to excel in ways that didn't require their approval or support. My grades climbed from mediocre to exceptional, not because I suddenly loved learning, but because I understood that education was my ticket out. Every A was a step further from Oleander Street, every scholarship application a potential key to freedom. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, noticed the change first. She was a sharp woman in her 50s, who had seen enough teenagers to recognize when one was running towards something, rather than running away from it. "Jessica, your academic performance has been remarkable this semester," she said during a mandatory check-in meeting. "Have you given any thought to college?" The word college had never been spoken in our house except as Tyler's assumed future. For me, it had seemed as distant and impossible as space travel. But I had been researching, planning, calculating every possible path forward. "I'm interested in the military," I said, watching her expression carefully. "Specifically, military intelligence." Mrs. Patterson leaned back in her chair, studying me with new interest. "That's specific. What draws you to that field?" How could I explain that I had spent 3 years learning to read people's weaknesses, to understand the psychology of power, to recognize the difference between what people said and what they meant? How could I tell her that living in my house had been like attending a masterclass in psychological warfare? "I'm good at understanding how people think," I said instead. "And I want to serve my country." The second part was true, though not in the way she might assume. I did want to serve. But more than that, I wanted to belong to something larger than the petty cruelties of family dysfunction. I wanted to be part of an organization that valued competence over favoritism, that measured worth through achievement rather than birth order. Mrs. Patterson connected me with Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a recruiter based out of the Bakersfield Military Entrance Processing Station. Santos was a compact woman with intelligent eyes, and the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. She had served 2 tours in Iraq before transitioning to recruitment, and she had a reputation for spotting potential in unlikely places. Our first meeting took place at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where my family couldn't accidentally interfere. I had prepared for this conversation like a job interview, researching military intelligence operations, memorizing requirements, understanding exactly what I needed to demonstrate to be taken seriously. "Tell me why you want to join the Army, Jessica," Santos said after we'd settled at a corner table with our drinks. I had practiced this answer, but sitting across from her, I found myself speaking more honestly than I'd intended. Because I want to disappear, I said. Not from the world, but from the version of myself that other people created. I want to become someone entirely new, someone who matters. Santos nodded slowly. And you think the military will give you that? I think the military will give me the tools to create that myself. Something shifted in her expression, a recognition that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced since Margaret Chen had bandaged my feet 3 years earlier. Military intelligence is competitive, she said. The requirements are stringent. You'd need top scores on the ASVAB, a clean background check, and the ability to obtain a security clearance. Plus, you'd have to complete basic training and advanced individual training. It's not easy. I don't want easy, I replied. I want to be effective. Over the following months, Santos became my unofficial mentor. She provided study materials for the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, connected me with current MI personnel who could explain the realities of the job, and helped me understand the commitment I was considering. At home, I said nothing about these meetings. My family had settled into a routine where my existence was acknowledged but not celebrated, which suited my purposes perfectly. Tyler was now a senior, basking in the attention that came with being quarterback of the varsity football team. My parents' energy was entirely focused on his college recruitment process, his scholarship opportunities, his bright future. I used their distraction to my advantage. While they attended Tyler's games and college visits, I worked shifts at a local diner, saving every penny for the life I was building. While they planned Tyler's graduation party, I studied for the ASVAB with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The test itself took place on a gray Saturday morning in March, at a testing center that smelled like pencil shavings and nervous sweat. I had prepared for months, taking practice tests until I could answer the questions in my sleep. But sitting in that sterile room, bubbling in answers on a Scantron sheet, I understood that this was more than an academic exercise. This was my declaration of independence, my formal application for a new life. When the results came back 2 weeks later, Santos called me personally. Jessica, you scored in the 97th percentile overall, with perfect scores in the sections that matter for intelligence work. Congratulations. I closed my eyes, standing in the parking lot of the diner where I worked, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Pride. Not the desperate, seeking kind that craved external validation, but the quiet, solid variety that comes from achieving something through your own effort. The paperwork process was lengthy and thorough. Background investigators interviewed teachers, employers, neighbors, anyone who might have insight into my character and reliability. I worried they might speak to my family, but when they finally did, the interviews were brief and unrevealing. My parents described me as quiet and responsible. Tyler as keeps to herself. Even in this official context, I remained invisible to them. The most challenging part was the psychological evaluation. I sat across from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a military psychologist who specialized in assessing candidates for sensitive positions, knowing that she was trained to detect exactly the kind of damage my family had inflicted. "Tell me about your childhood, Jessica," she said, her voice professionally neutral. I had prepared for this question, understanding that honesty was required, but that the wrong kind of honesty could disqualify me. I told her about feeling disconnected from my family, about being the less favored child, about learning to be self-reliant at an early age. I was careful to frame my experiences as character building rather than traumatic, as motivation rather than damage. "What draws you to intelligence work specifically?" she asked. "I'm good at observing people," I said. "I notice things that others miss. I understand that information is power, and I want to use that understanding to protect my country." Dr. Walsh made notes, asked follow-up questions about my social relationships, my coping mechanisms, and my long-term goals. I answered carefully, presenting myself as resilient rather than wounded, strategic rather than vengeful. 2 months later, I received my security clearance approval and my official orders. I would ship to Fort Moore, Georgia for basic training in August, immediately after my 18th birthday. From there, I would attend the Military Intelligence Basic Officer Leader course at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. I had done it. I had created an escape route that would take me 3,000 miles from Oleander Street, that would give me new skills, new identity, new purpose. I had transformed myself from a discarded daughter into a soldier, from a victim into someone with agency. The night before I left for basic training, I packed my single duffel bag with the few possessions that mattered: Margaret Chen's business card, my journal, a photo of my grandmother that I'd rescued from the garage. Everything else I left behind. My family was watching television when I walked through the living room toward the front door. Tyler looked up from his phone briefly. My mother glanced over from her magazine. My father didn't acknowledge me at all. "See you later," Tyler said casually, as if I were going to the store rather than leaving forever. "Take care, honey," my mother added, her attention already drifting back to her magazine. My father said nothing. I stood there for a moment, looking at them, really looking, and realized that this was exactly how I had always wanted it to end. Not with drama or tearful goodbyes, but with the kind of indifference that confirmed I was making the right choice. "Goodbye," I said, though I knew they weren't really listening. I walked out the front door of that house on Oleander Street and never looked back. Behind me was Jessica Morgan, the forgotten daughter, the barn girl, the punchline to someone else's cruel joke. Ahead of me was whoever I chose to become. The bus to Fort Moore left at dawn, and I was ready. Basic training at Fort Moore was designed to break you down and rebuild you as a soldier. For most recruits, this process was traumatic. The systematic stripping away of civilian identity, the harsh discipline, the constant evaluation and criticism. For me, it felt like coming home. Drill Sergeant Rebecca Torres was a 12-year veteran who had served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. She was exactly the kind of person who would have terrified the old Jessica, someone who demanded excellence and had no patience for excuses. But I had been preparing for someone like Torres my entire life. "Morgan," she barked during our first week, her voice cutting through the Georgia humidity like a blade. "You think you're special because you can follow orders without crying about it?" "No, Drill Sergeant," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "Good. Because special gets you killed in the field. Reliable keeps you alive. Which one are you planning to be?" "Reliable, Drill Sergeant." She studied me for a moment, her dark eyes searching for weakness, for the crack that would reveal my true nature. But I had learned long ago how to show people only what they needed to see. "We'll see," she said, and moved on to terrorize the next recruit. The physical challenges of basic training were brutal but manageable. Years of walking everywhere because my family wouldn't provide transportation had given me endurance. The mental challenges were where I truly excelled. While other recruits struggled with the psychological pressure, the constant scrutiny, the deliberate attempts to provoke emotional responses, I found myself oddly comfortable. This was just another version of the game I'd been playing at home. Survive by being invisible when necessary, competent when required, and never, ever give them ammunition to use against you. My bunkmate was a girl named Sarah Kim from Portland, Oregon, who had joined the Army to pay for medical school. She was smart, dedicated, and came from the kind of loving family that worried about her safety and sent care packages filled with homemade cookies. "Don't you miss them?" she asked one night during our third week, after reading a letter from her parents that made her cry with homesickness. "Your family, I mean. Don't you wonder what they're doing?" I looked up from the manual I was studying, Advanced Military Intelligence Procedures, and considered how to answer. The truth was that I had wondered, but not in the way she meant. I wondered if Tyler had gotten the football scholarship he wanted, if my parents had finally converted my bedroom into the home office they'd always talked about, if they'd noticed that I never called. "No," I said simply, "I don't miss them." Sarah looked at me with the kind of concern reserved for people who seemed fundamentally broken. That's really sad, Jessica. Everyone misses their family." "Not everyone has a family worth missing," I replied, returning to my manual. After that, Sarah stopped asking personal questions, though I sometimes caught her watching me with a mixture of pity and fear, as if my lack of homesickness might be contagious. I graduated basic training in the top 5% of my class and shipped immediately to Fort Huachuca for advanced individual training in military intelligence. The Arizona desert was a stark contrast to Georgia's humidity, all harsh angles and unforgiving light, a landscape that demanded respect through its very indifference. The MI training was intensive and intellectually demanding in ways that basic training had not been. We studied signals intelligence, human intelligence, counterintelligence, and imagery analysis. We learned to read enemy communications, to identify threats through pattern analysis, and to understand the psychology of information warfare. My instructor for strategic intelligence analysis was Captain Elena Rodriguez, a career intelligence officer who had spent her entire adult life in the shadowy world of classified information. She was in her early 40s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that could dissect a problem with surgical precision. Intelligence work, she told our class during the first week, is not about collecting secrets. It's about understanding people. Every piece of intelligence we gather is ultimately a story about human behavior. What people want, what they fear, what they're willing to sacrifice to protect. She paused, her gaze scanning the classroom of eager young soldiers. Your job is to become fluent in the language of human motivation. You need to understand not just what people do, but why they do it. And more importantly, what they might do next. This lesson resonated with me in a way that surprised even myself. I had been studying human motivation my entire life, learning to read my father's moods to avoid his anger, understanding my mother's patterns to navigate her enabling, recognizing Tyler's manipulations before he deployed them. What I hadn't realized was that these skills had value beyond mere survival. They could be weaponized, refined, turned into professional competence. During a practical exercise in behavioral analysis, we were given surveillance footage of a suspected foreign agent and asked to create a psychological profile based on his actions. While my classmates focused on obvious details, his clothing, his route, his apparent destinations, I noticed subtler patterns. The subject exhibits hypervigilance consistent with someone under significant stress, I wrote in my assessment. His behavior suggests he's aware of surveillance but trying not to appear aware. Notice how he checks his phone at regular intervals, but never when he thinks he might be observed. He's communicating with handlers but trying to maintain plausible deniability. Captain Rodriguez read my analysis aloud to the class, using it as an example of intuitive intelligence gathering. Private Morgan has identified something the rest of you missed, she said. This subject isn't just following orders, he's terrified. Fear makes people predictable, and predictability makes them vulnerable. Understanding his emotional state gives us leverage we can exploit. After the exercise, she asked me to stay behind. Where did you learn to read people like that? She asked, settling behind her desk with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. I considered my answer carefully. I grew up in a complicated family, I said finally. I learned early that survival meant understanding what people really wanted, not just what they said they wanted. Captain Rodriguez nodded slowly. Have you considered a career in counterintelligence? You have natural instincts that can't be taught. Counterintelligence meant hunting spies, identifying security threats, protecting classified information from foreign adversaries. It was a field that required the ability to think like your enemy, to anticipate their moves, to understand their weaknesses well enough to exploit them. I'm interested, I said. Good, I'm recommending you for advanced training after you complete your initial assignment. There's a program at Fort Belvoir that trains specialists in human intelligence operations. It's competitive, but I think you'd excel. My first operational assignment was with the 525th Military Intelligence Brigade at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I was part of a small team responsible for analyzing communications intercepts from various global hotspots, looking for patterns that might indicate emerging threats. The work was meticulous and often tedious, hours spent listening to recorded conversations in languages I was still learning, cross-referencing intelligence reports, building databases of suspected terrorist networks. But I found a deep satisfaction in the puzzle-solving aspect of it. The way seemingly unrelated pieces of information could suddenly form a coherent picture. My team leader was Master Sergeant David Chen, no relation to Margaret, though the coincidence of the name always made me smile. He was a 20-year veteran who had served in every major conflict since the Gulf War, and he had the rare ability to teach through example rather than lecture. Intelligence analysis, he told me during my first week, is like doing a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces are missing and some of the pieces you have belong to different puzzles entirely. Your job is to figure out what the picture is supposed to look like anyway. He was right. Much of our work involved making educated guesses based on incomplete information, then testing those guesses against new data as it became available. It required a particular kind of intellectual confidence, the ability to make decisions without certainty, to act on probability rather than proof. I discovered that I had a talent for seeing connections that others missed. While my colleagues focused on analyzing individual communications, I began tracking behavioral patterns across multiple sources. I created maps that showed not just who was talking to whom, but when they talked, how often, and what external events seemed to trigger increased communication. This approach led to my first significant intelligence breakthrough. By tracking communication patterns between suspected terrorist cells in 3 different countries, I identified a previously unknown network that was planning coordinated attacks on U.S. interests in the Middle East. The intelligence I developed helped prevent those attacks and led to the arrest of several key operatives. For the first time in my life, I had not just survived something, I had actively protected others. The girl who had been abandoned at a barn in California had become someone who could save lives through her ability to understand human nature. Captain Rodriguez's recommendation came through 6 months later. I was accepted into the Advanced Human Intelligence course at Fort Belvoir, a program that would teach me to recruit and handle foreign assets, to conduct complex psychological operations, and to become what the military called a, quote, case officer. The night before I left Fort Bragg, I sat in my small apartment and wrote a letter I would never send. It was addressed to my family, though I had no intention of mailing it. I wrote about the person I had become, about the work I was doing, about the life I had built from the ashes of their cruelty. "You thought you were throwing me away," I wrote. "You thought the barn was the end of my story, but it was just the beginning. While you were focused on Tyler's small victories, I was learning to save the world. While you were celebrating ordinary achievements, I was becoming extraordinary." I folded the letter and put it in my personal file, along with a few other mementos I had kept from my past. Someday, I thought, I might need to remember exactly who I used to be. But for now, I was focused entirely on who I was becoming. The training at Fort Belvoir would teach me skills I couldn't yet imagine, give me tools I didn't know I needed. But I was ready for whatever came next. I had learned the most important lesson of all. The people who try to destroy you can only succeed if you let them define who you are. I refused to let them define me. And soon, I would be in a position to define them instead. The advanced training at Fort Belvoir transformed me into someone I barely recognized from the girl who had once walked barefoot down a dirt road in California. Over 18 months, I learned psychological manipulation techniques that would have made my father seem like an amateur, surveillance methods that could track a target across multiple continents, and interrogation strategies that could break the most hardened operative. But more than the technical skills, I learned something fundamental about power. It wasn't something you demanded or inherited. It was something you earned through competence, patience, and the willingness to wait for exactly the right moment to use it. My final assignment in the program paired me with a veteran case officer named Colonel Patricia Hayes for a complex operation in Eastern Europe. We were tasked with turning a mid-level Russian intelligence officer who had access to information about cyber warfare operations targeting U.S. infrastructure. The target, Viktor Petrov, was a man in his 50s with a gambling addiction and a daughter attending university in London, whose tuition he could barely afford. Classic recruitment material, someone with both vulnerabilities and access. "Remember, Morgan," Colonel Hayes told me as we prepared for the initial approach, "this isn't about outsmarting him. It's about understanding what he needs and becoming the person who can provide it. People don't betray their countries for ideology anymore. They do it for much more personal reasons." The recruitment took 4 months of careful cultivation. I became Petrov's American contact at conferences, his sympathetic ear at diplomatic receptions, the person who could solve his financial problems without asking uncomfortable questions. I learned his routines, his weaknesses, his fears for his daughter's future. When he finally agreed to provide intelligence, it wasn't because I had coerced him. It was because I had made betraying his government feel like the most logical choice he could make. The intelligence he provided prevented 3 major cyber attacks and earned me a commendation that would follow me for the rest of my career. "You have a gift," Colonel Hayes told me after the operation concluded successfully. Most officers have to learn to compartmentalize their emotions to do this work effectively. You seem to have been born that way." She was right, though she couldn't have known why. I had learned emotional compartmentalization as a survival skill long before it became a professional asset. The ability to separate what I felt from what I needed to accomplish had been forged in a house on Oleander Street, refined by years of strategic invisibility. After Fort Belvoir, I was assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington, D.C., where I spent 3 years working counterintelligence operations against foreign agents operating on American soil. My success rate was exceptional, not because I was particularly ruthless, but because I understood desperation, manipulation, and the psychology of people who felt cornered by circumstances beyond their control. I had lived in that psychological space for most of my childhood. My reputation in the intelligence community grew steadily. I was the case officer who could recruit impossible targets, who could see patterns that others missed, who never let personal feelings compromise operational effectiveness. By the time I reached the rank of major, I was being consulted on operations far above my pay grade. It was during this period that I made a decision that would change everything. I hired a private investigator to monitor my family. The investigator, David Wong, was a former FBI agent who specialized in deep background research. I told him I needed regular updates on the Morgan family of Bakersfield, California, their financial status, health issues, legal problems, anything that might be relevant to a security clearance review. It wasn't entirely a lie. People with my level of clearance were required to report significant changes in family circumstances, but my real motivation was simpler. I wanted to know when the moment would come. The reports arrived quarterly, typed summaries of ordinary lives proceeding without me. Tyler had received a partial football scholarship to Fresno State, but tore his ACL junior year, ending his athletic career. He'd graduated with a degree in business administration and was working as an insurance adjuster, married to his high school girlfriend, living in a tract house 3 miles from where we grew up. My mother had developed diabetes and high blood pressure, chronic conditions that were manageable but expensive. My father had retired from his security job at a local warehouse due to persistent back problems and was receiving disability benefits that barely covered their basic expenses. They were aging, ordinary people living ordinary lives, and that ordinariness felt like the greatest insult of all. While I had built myself into someone who could influence global events, they had remained exactly who they had always been: small, cruel people whose biggest achievement was the systematic destruction of a child's self-worth. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, 11 years after I had left California. I was in my Pentagon office, reviewing intelligence reports from the Middle East, when my secure phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Major Morgan? This is Tyler Morgan. I'm your brother." I set down the report I'd been reading and leaned back in my chair. After all these years, after all the silence, hearing his voice felt surreal. "Tyler," I said, my voice professionally neutral, "what can I do for you?" "It's Dad," he said, and I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. He had a massive stroke 3 days ago. He's at Kern Medical Center, and the doctors say he might not make it. I waited for him to continue, offering no comfort, no reassurance, no acknowledgement of the family connection he was trying to invoke. "The thing is," Tyler went on, "his insurance paperwork still lists you as his primary healthcare proxy, from when you were a minor, I guess. We never changed it after you left, and now we can't make any medical decisions without your authorization." The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. The man who had abandoned me at a barn, who had made me understand that I was disposable, was now entirely dependent on my willingness to save him. "I see," I said. "And what exactly are you asking me to do?" "We need you to come home, or at least sign the paperwork so we can authorize his treatment. He needs surgery, but it's risky, and the doctors won't proceed without consent from his healthcare proxy. Which is me. Which is you." I let the silence stretch between us, imagining Tyler in some hospital waiting room, probably wearing the same confused expression he'd had as a child when adults discuss things beyond his comprehension. "Tyler," I said finally, "do you remember my 14th birthday?" The question clearly caught him off guard. "Your what?" "Jessica, this isn't the time for..." Do you remember it? A long pause. Sort of. I mean, that was a long time ago. You recorded it, I said. You posted it online. You called it the best prank ever. Jessica, that was just... We were kids. Dad said it was just a joke that got out of hand. A joke. I repeated the words carefully, tasting them. You thought it was funny to abandon a 14-year-old girl in the middle of nowhere on her birthday. You thought it was entertaining to film her distress and share it with her classmates. Jessica, I was 11. I didn't understand. You understood enough to laugh. You understood enough to call me a barn girl for years afterward. Tyler's voice became smaller, more desperate. Please, Jessica, whatever happened between us, he's still our father. He's dying. No, I said, and the word felt clean and final. He's your father. He stopped being mine the day he left me at that barn. I could hear Tyler starting to cry, which should have moved me but didn't. Please, I know we weren't good to you, but he's family. Family, I repeated. Tyler, let me tell you what I've learned about family. Real family doesn't abandon children in the middle of nowhere for entertainment. Real family doesn't film a child's trauma and post it online for likes. Real family doesn't spend years making someone feel worthless and then expect loyalty when it becomes convenient. Jessica, I'm not finished. My voice remained calm, professional, the tone I used when delivering intelligence briefings that could affect national security. Your father is in a hospital bed because his body is failing him. That's unfortunate, but it's not my responsibility. I didn't cause his stroke, and I'm not obligated to prevent its consequences. But you're the only one who can authorize. I know exactly what I can authorize, I interrupted. I've spent the last 11 years becoming someone with real power, someone who makes decisions that affect thousands of lives. Your father taught me that power matters by showing me what it feels like to have none. Now I have it, and he doesn't. The line was quiet except for the sound of Tyler's breathing. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. I'm going to fax the hospital a form declining to serve as your father's healthcare proxy. The responsibility will revert to your mother as his spouse. She can make whatever decisions she thinks are appropriate. But she's not. She can't handle this kind of pressure. She's never made decisions like this. Then she'll learn, just like I learned to walk down a dirt road with bleeding feet, just like I learned to survive without the family that was supposed to protect me. Just like I learned to build a life from nothing because the people who should have loved me taught me that I was nothing. Tyler was crying openly now. This isn't you, Jessica. This isn't who you are. You're wrong, I said. This is exactly who I am. I'm the person your family created. When you decided that my pain was your entertainment, I'm the person who learned that the only way to survive people like you is to become stronger than you ever imagined possible. I paused, letting that sink in. Your father is dying, Tyler. That's a natural consequence of the life he chose to live. I'm not going to save him, not because I'm cruel, but because I don't owe him salvation. He taught me that family is conditional, that love is earned through compliance, that some people are disposable. I learned those lessons well. Please, Tyler whispered. I'm begging you. Did I beg when you left me at that barn? Did my tears move you when you were laughing at me through the truck window? Did any of you consider mercy when you turned my trauma into entertainment? The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he had hung up. The fax will be sent within the hour, I said finally. The hospital will have the legal authority they need to proceed however your mother decides. Whether your father lives or dies will be determined by his medical condition and her choices. I won't be involved. Jessica, wait. I hung up. The paperwork took 15 minutes to complete. A simple form declining healthcare proxy responsibilities, signed and witnessed by my assistant, then faxed to Kern Medical Center's legal department. With those signatures, I severed the last legal connection between myself and the man who had taught me that I was worthless. 2 days later, David Wong sent me a brief update. Robert Morgan had died during surgery to repair brain damage from his stroke. Linda Morgan had authorized the procedure despite the risks, but his body had been too damaged to survive the operation. I read the report in my Pentagon office. Surrounded by classified documents and intelligence briefings that could influence global events, I waited for some emotional response. Grief, relief, satisfaction, anything that would mark the end of this chapter of my life. Instead, I felt nothing at all. That evening, I drove to Arlington National Cemetery and walked among the graves of soldiers who had given their lives for something larger than themselves. These were people who had understood honor, sacrifice, and the difference between serving your country and serving your own interests. My father had been a corrections officer for 15 years, but he had never served anything beyond his own need for dominance. He had worn a uniform, but he had never been a protector. He had wielded authority, but he had never understood responsibility. Standing among those white headstones, I realized that his death didn't matter to me because his life had never mattered to me. He had been a cautionary tale, a template for the kind of person I refused to become. His greatest contribution to my existence had been showing me exactly what I needed to escape. The next morning, I submitted a request for extended leave and flew to California for the first time in 11 years. Not for the funeral. I had no intention of attending that, but to visit Margaret Chen, the woman who had bandaged my feet and called Child Protective Services when my own family wouldn't come to collect me. Margaret was now in her 70s, still sharp, still living in the same ranch house where she had offered sanctuary to a bleeding 14-year-old girl. She welcomed me with the same quiet kindness she had shown all those years ago, though now I could see her taking in the changes, the confident posture, the expensive clothes, the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "You look good, Jessica," she said as we sat on her porch with iced tea. "You look like someone who figured out who she wanted to be." "I had a good example," I said. "You showed me what it looked like when an adult actually cared about a child's welfare." Margaret studied my face. "I heard about your father's passing. I'm sorry for your loss." "I'm not," I said simply. "I lost him a long time ago. What happened this week was just his body catching up with reality." She nodded slowly. "That's honest, at least. People always want to pretend that death creates forgiveness, but some things don't deserve to be forgiven." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the California sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Finally, Margaret spoke again. "What are you going to do now?" It was a good question. For 11 years, my life had been shaped by the need to become strong enough that what had happened at that barn could never happen again. I had succeeded beyond my wildest dreams, building myself into someone with real power, real influence, real control over my own destiny. But now that chapter was closed. My father was dead, my family was irrelevant, and I was free to choose what came next, without reference to what had come before. "I think I'm going to keep serving," I said, "but maybe in a different way. There are other kids out there who need someone to believe in them, someone to show them that they can survive their families and build something better." Margaret smiled. "That sounds like exactly the right thing to do." That night, I drove past the old barn where it had all started. The structure had finally collapsed completely, nothing left but a pile of weathered wood slowly being reclaimed by the weeds. I parked and walked to where I thought the door had been, though it was hard to be certain. Standing in that spot, I tried to remember the 14-year-old girl who had stood here in a yellow dress, abandoned and alone, believing she was worthless because the people who should have loved her had taught her she was disposable. That girl was gone, replaced by someone who understood that worth wasn't something other people could grant or take away. It was something you created through your choices, your actions, your willingness to become better than the circumstances that had shaped you. I had spent 11 years proving that I was not the person my family had tried to make me. Now I was free to spend the rest of my life proving who I actually was. The barn was gone, but I was still here. That felt like victory enough. 3 months later, I submitted my resignation from active duty and accepted a position with a nonprofit organization that worked with children aging out of the foster care system. The skills I had learned in intelligence work, reading people, understanding motivation, recognizing potential in unlikely places, translated perfectly to helping young people navigate the transition to independence. My first client was a 17-year-old girl named Maria Santos, who had been abandoned by her family and was living in her third foster placement in 2 years. She was angry, defensive, and absolutely certain that no adult could be trusted to have her best interests at heart. "Why should I believe anything you tell me?" she asked during our first meeting, her arms crossed, her expression hostile. Because I've been where you are, I said, and I know the difference between surviving and thriving. I want to teach you how to do both. She stared at me for a long moment, then slowly uncrossed her arms. Okay, she said, show me. And so I did. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.